Hey everyone, welcome to the show.
Hey, the world we live in today, it's almost hard to grasp how much it was shaped by events centuries ago.
Totally. Like imagine a world where planting a simple seed could, I don't know, reshape whole continents, start wars, even define who we are.
It sounds like something out of science fiction almost.
Right. But it's real history. It's this incredible, often overlooked story of how things got globally connected after 1492.
It's a story of, well, connection, but also immense upheaval, both creation and destruction, really all tangled together.
Okay, so that's what we're diving into. This isn't just dry history. It reads more like an adventure story, honestly. It uncovers these surprising biological and human consequences of the age of exploration.
Really surprising connections.
Exactly. So if you're ready to maybe rethink some history you thought you knew and uncover some mind-blowing links, definitely hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives like this.
So, the core idea we're exploring today comes from this period right after 1492. It's about realizing how much our modern, interconnected world owes to that time, the good and, frankly, the very bad.
Precisely. And our guide for this is Charles C. Mann's brilliant book, 1493. We've got the Amazon link down in the description, by the way.
Yeah, it's a fantastic read.
It really is. And look, this isn't just another Columbus book. It goes way deeper into the ecological and economic shifts that came after him.
It's about the exchange plants, animals, diseases, how all that mixing literally created the world we recognize now.
In ways you probably never even considered. So yeah, get ready for some serious aha moments today.
Okay, so the big premise in 1493, the starting point, is really wild when you think about it. Before Columbus, the world's ecosystems, they were pretty much separate.
Like different planets almost, biologically speaking.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Pangaea broke apart millions of years ago, right? And life on each fragment went its own way. Totally distinct evolutionary paths.
Like these huge, isolated natural labs running separate experiments for millennia.
Uh-huh. And then, bam, Columbus's voyages start. And the historian Alfred Crosby had this great phrase for it: reknitting the seams of Pangaea.
Reknitting Pangaea, I like that. It captures the scale.
It does, because it kicked off what we now call the Columbian Exchange, this massive, unprecedented mixing of species back and forth across the oceans.
And this is where it gets really mind-bending for daily life. Right?
Totally. Think about it. No tomatoes in Italy before this.
Wow. No pasta pomodoro.
Right. No oranges in Florida. No chocolate in Switzerland.
Okay, my world is collapsing slightly. No chili peppers in Thailand.
Nope. All imports thanks to this exchange. It's why ecologists see it as like one of the biggest biological events since the dinosaurs died out.
That really puts it in perspective.
Yeah.
Dinosaurs level impact. But, okay, it wasn't just about food, was it? These biological swaps had much bigger ripples.
Oh, way bigger. Alfred Crosby, in another key work, Ecological Imperialism, he really dug into how these plants, animals, actually helped European immigration happen.
How so?
Well, introducing European livestock, for example. It completely changed landscapes in the Americas, Australia, often clashing hard with how indigenous people were already farming or using the land.
So it's not just adding new things, it's actively reshaping entire ecosystems and impacting the people already living there.
Precisely. These biological changes triggered massive social and economic effects that, honestly, we're still dealing with today.
And 1493 doesn't pull any punches about well, the human cost of this exchange.
Yeah.
Especially the movement of people.
No, it faces that head on. And the most significant and the most tragic human movement by far was the slave trade.
Yeah.
Get this statistic. Until around 1700, something like 90% of people crossing the Atlantic Ocean were African captives.
90%. That just,
Yeah.
it forces you to completely rethink the standard story of exploration, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The sheer scale of that forced migration is horrific.
It is. And it's crucial to remember, as the book points out, it wasn't only Africans being enslaved. Native Americans were also forced into labor, adding another layer to the demographic upheaval and the suffering.
So the Americas become this landscape reshaped by Europeans, yes, but profoundly populated by Africans, Native Americans, and eventually people of mixed heritage.
Yeah.
Afro-Indians, mestizos, mulattoes.
Right. And those interactions, the cultures they built, the resistance they mounted, that's a huge part of the story that's often been sidelined or hidden. It's only now really coming more into focus.
So if we look through this ecological and economic lens, how does it change the usual story of history? The one focused on, brave explorers and better ships.
Well, it shifts the focus dramatically, I think. It shows how fundamental these biological forces were, and economic drivers, too. Less about individual heroism, maybe, and more about these huge systemic
It
changes.
makes globalization seem much older, too.
Exactly. We think of globalization as maybe the last few decades or the internet age. But Mann argues it's been happening intensely for 5 centuries.
Since 1492, basically.
Yeah, and it's always been this double-edged sword. It brings new things, enrichment, innovation, sure. But 1493 really details the flip side.
Hmm.
Ecological chaos, incredible human suffering, political conflict. That's also globalization's history.
It's a much messier, more complex picture than the simple narratives.
Hmm.
But is there also a sense of grandeur in seeing it all connected?
I think so. There's something powerful in understanding how every place, every group, played a role, willingly or not, in creating this single interconnected story of life on Earth, even if it's often a tragic story.
Okay, let's zoom in on Columbus himself. The book gives him a pretty critical look, doesn't it?
It does. It contrasts the sort of hero-founder myth with the reality of his actions, like his first settlement, La Isabela.
Yeah.
It's practically gone, vanished, which is kind of symbolic in a way.
Columbus the man.
Yeah.
It's yet the view has shifted.
Yeah.
Much more focused now on his cruelty, his role in the suffering of the Taino people and others.
Definitely. But the book also acknowledges, okay, whatever his flaws, and they were major, his voyages did kickstart this new era. He connected worlds that had been separate for millions of years. It's a really uncomfortable legacy.
Morally complex, for sure.
Yeah.
And his motivation wasn't just pure discovery, right? Economics played a huge part for his backers, Ferdinand and Isabella.
Oh, absolutely. They weren't funding him out of scientific curiosity. They wanted a shortcut to Asia.
The riches of the East, spices, silk.
Exactly.
Hmm.
They wanted to bypass the trade routes controlled by Islamic powers and the Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa.
Right.
Find a direct pipeline to the source.
And Columbus's geographical mistake actually helped him sell it.
Kind of ironic, isn't it? He massively underestimated how big the Earth was.
So he thought Asia was much closer going west.
Yeah. Which made his proposed westward voyage seem much shorter and more feasible to the Spanish monarchs. They saw a potential economic windfall.
Amazing how a calculation error could ripple through history like that.
Isn't it? And that quest for Asia, for China, kept driving Spanish efforts long after Columbus. It connects him directly to Cortés conquering the Aztecs and Legazpi reaching the Philippines.
It really ties it all together. That mention of Legazpi. You said there's a statue in Manila that symbolizes this early globalization.
Yeah, it's a great example of unintended meaning. The statue is for Legazpi and another Basque explorer, Urdaneta. It was meant to celebrate their role in founding Manila.
Okay.
But what Legazpi and Urdaneta really established was the Manila Galleon trade route, the route that carried tons of silver from the Americas across the Pacific to Asia, especially China, mainly to buy Chinese goods.
So the statue accidentally becomes a monument to the start of this massive Pacific silver trade.
Pretty much. A monument to globalization, fueled by American silver.
And that silver, it came from places like Potosi in Bolivia, right? The scale was enormous.
Unimaginable. Potosi was literally a mountain of silver. The amount extracted there, and from mines in Mexico, probably tripled the world's money supply in a couple of centuries.
Tripled it.
Yeah. It basically created the first truly globalized economy, all lubricated by this American silver.
But the cost, the human cost of mining that silver and the environmental cost.
Horrific. Millions of indigenous people died, not just from the brutal labor conditions, but mainly from European diseases like smallpox that swept through.
Leaving behind those ghost landscapes, the abandoned terraces.
Exactly. Silent evidence of the catastrophe. And the book paints this incredible picture of Mexico City around 1642.
What was it like?
A bustling, messy, global city full of Europeans, Africans, indigenous people, Asians arriving on the galleon speaking dozens of languages,
Right.
but also dealing with massive ecological problems like constant flooding because of how the city was built and deforestation around it, and this incredibly complex racial hierarchy trying to make sense of all the mixing.
Like mestizo, mulatto.
Yeah, and coyote, lobo, all these terms trying to categorize people in this new jumbled world. It sounds almost like a 21st century megacity in some ways.
That's fascinating. Okay, let's switch gears to another American product that went global. Tobacco.
Ah, tobacco. What a story. A plant from South America becomes this global obsession.
Jamestown, Virginia is key here, right? John Rolfe.
That's the turning point for English involvement. Rolfe figures out how to cultivate a sweeter variety of tobacco that Europeans loved. Suddenly, Jamestown has a cash crop, a very profitable one.
It basically saved the colony economically.
It did, but it also kicked off England's deep dive into the Columbian Exchange, and smoking just exploded in Europe. London apparently had thousands of tobacco houses pop up really quickly.
Like cafes, but for smoking.
Sort of, yeah. It became this aristocratic craze, then spread through society.
But that focus on tobacco in Jamestown,
Mm.
it had other consequences too, ecologically.
Yeah, it meant monoculture, planting vast fields of just tobacco, which is very different from how the local Powhatan people farmed.
How did they farm?
They used sophisticated intercropping, planting corn, beans, squashed together, the Three Sisters, which supports the soil and biodiversity. European monoculture was much harder on the land. Plus, the English brought pigs and cattle.
Which would have run rampant through native fields.
Exactly, a huge source of conflict. And we can't forget how brutal those early Jamestown years were. Disease, starvation, the starving time.
Right, and disease.
Mm.
You mentioned malaria earlier. The book really emphasizes its impact differently from smallpox.
Yeah, malaria wasn't like smallpox, which came in devastating waves, epidemics. Malaria became endemic in many parts of the Americas.
Meaning it was just there all the time.
Pretty much, especially in warmer, wetter regions, a constant debilitating presence. It fundamentally reshaped where people could live and thrive.
So places that were once heavily populated became unhealthy.
That's right. Think about the U.S. Southeast or the coastal lowlands in Mesoamerica, parts of the Amazon. Once supported large populations but became malaria and yellow fever hotspots.
And how to get there.
Well, there are different strains. Plasmodium vivax, a less severe form, probably came early with Europeans, but Plasmodium falciparum, the really deadly one, almost certainly arrived with the African slave trade.
Carried by mosquitoes native to the Americas.
Exactly. The Anopheles mosquito, common on the East Coast, was a perfect vector, so this tiny insect becomes a major player in history.
It's chilling. Thinking a mosquito-borne parasite could weaken entire populations, maybe even influence the outcome of wars, like Opechancano's fight against the Virginians.
It likely played a role, weakening both colonists and Native Americans, changing the dynamics of power and conflict.
So how does this connect back to slavery? You mentioned the disease environment.
Right. So colonists in Virginia needed labor. They could use indentured servants from Europe or enslave people, either Native Americans or Africans.
And initially, they sometimes preferred Native American slaves.
Yeah, often cheaper up front, and crucially, no end date to their service like indentured servants had.
But then malaria takes hold.
Exactly. And it hits Europeans who have no immunity really hard. It makes places like the Virginia Tidewater, the Carolinas, incredibly deadly for them.
Okay.
And here's the brutal irony. West Africans, having lived in malarial regions for millennia, had developed some genetic resistance, things like sickle cell trait.
So their partial immunity made them more valuable as laborers in those specific deadly environments.
Perversely, yes, it became a factor. Their ability to survive where Europeans often died made them a preferred source of forced labor in malarial zones. Disease resistance became weaponized in a sense.
That is deeply disturbing.
It is. And then you look at the Caribbean sugar plantations. They were perfect breeding grounds for the mosquitoes carrying yellow fever, too. Made those islands lethal for non-immune Europeans, further driving the demand for enslaved Africans.
Wow. Okay, let's shift across the globe now to China. We mentioned silver flowing there, but what about American crops?
Huge impact. Often overlooked, but maize, potatoes, and especially sweet potatoes, they transformed Chinese agriculture and society.
Really? I don't usually associate those with traditional Chinese food.
Maybe not now in the same way, but historically they were massive. They could grow in places where rice and wheat couldn't. Hillsides, marginal lands.
So they allowed China to feed a much larger population.
Exactly. Contributed to a major population boom during the Qing dynasty. But again, unintended consequences. Planting maize on steep hillsides led to deforestation, soil erosion.
And worse, flooding downstream.
Yep, especially in the big river valleys like the Yangtze. So, more food, but also new environmental problems.
And the Qing government actually encouraged people to move into new areas to plant these crops.
They did. Pushed settlement westward into lands they saw as empty, though indigenous groups were often already there, and these American crops were key to making that settlement possible.
What about tobacco in China?
Oh, it became incredibly popular there, too. Smoked by everyone, from scholars to peasants. Another American plant taking the world by storm.
And the silver trade we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
How did that play out within China?
It caused major economic shifts. Under the late Ming Dynasty, all that incoming silver led to inflation, made the currency unstable, it destabilized things.
And later, the king tried to control coastal trade.
Right. Their coastal evacuation policy, meant to cut off rebels, actually ended up strengthening pirate warlords like Kuxinga Zheng Qinggong because he could control the flow of silver and trade. Another unintended consequence.
It's just layers upon layers of connection. Okay, let's talk potatoes again. Such a staple. Where did they start?
The Andes. Incredible diversity. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of varieties originally, wild and cultivated by indigenous peoples for millennia.
And when they got to Europe, game changer, you said.
Huge game changer. Why? Well, first, you could grow them on land you'd normally leave fallow empty to recover between grain crops. So, more food from the same land.
Okay.
Plus, they outcompeted weeds, and they packed way more calories per acre than grains like wheat or rye.
So just much more efficient food production.
Massively. In regions that adopted the potato, like Ireland, Northern Europe, routine famine basically disappeared for a long time.
Until, of course, dependence on basically one variety led to the blight.
Exactly, the danger of monoculture again. And to boost that European agriculture even more, another American resource became vital: guano.
Okay, you have to explain the bird droppings thing again. Guano. As fertilizer.
Seriously, huge deposits of ancient seabird excrement on islands off the coast of Peru. Turns out, it's incredibly rich in nitrogen and phosphates.
Plant food, basically.
The best kind. Thanks to chemists like Justus von Liebig figuring out exactly what nutrients plants needed, guano became like gold dust for European farmers in the 19th century. It fueled much more intensive farming.
Often focused on those single crops, those monocultures.
Right, which then made them vulnerable to new problems like the Colorado potato beetle.
Ah, the beetle.
Yeah, it originated in the Rockies, feeding on a wild relative of the potato. But once potato monoculture spread across the U.S.,
It had an endless buffet.
exactly. And with railroads, it could spread incredibly fast. Wiped out crops. It showed how vulnerable these systems were and how modern transport could spread pests globally. Another side effect of connection.
Okay, from potatoes and pests to rubber. Another Amazonian resource with a dark history.
Very dark. Indigenous people in the Amazon knew about rubber, used it for waterproofing, balls, syringes even.
But then industrial demand hit.
Yeah. Charles Goodyear figures out vulcanization, makes rubber stable and usable for tires, hoses, waterproof coats. Suddenly, the demand skyrockets in Europe and the U.S.
Leading to the scramble for the Amazon.
Yes. Fortune seekers poured in, and the methods used to force indigenous people to tap rubber trees were just brutal. Slavery, torture, murder. The operations run by people like Julio Cesar Arana in the Putumayo region were horrific.
A really grim chapter.
Absolutely. Eventually, rubber seeds were smuggled out, plantations were set up in Southeast Asia, which broke the Amazon monopoly but created new ecological issues there: deforestation, water use, vulnerability to disease.
It seems like every commodity has this complex, often brutal backstory linked to the exchange. Sugar is another huge one,
Yeah.
right? Linked to plantations and slavery from early on.
Definitely. The model of the sugar plantation, large estate, single crop, intense, often forced labor, was really developed earlier in the Mediterranean and Atlantic islands, even during the Crusades.
And that model was transferred to the Americas.
Yes, and the sheer labor needed for sugarcane cultivation and processing. That became a primary engine driving the transatlantic slave trade. European producers found it more profitable to use enslaved Africans than paid European or even indentured labor.
And you mentioned earlier, even the Spanish, despite official disapproval sometimes, were quick to enslave indigenous people.
Yeah, the book makes the point that for many early colonists, getting labor was a much higher priority than, say, religious conversion, regardless of what the crown might decree back in Spain. Enslavement happened early and often.
And by the 1600s, enslaved Africans were everywhere in the Spanish Americas, not just on sugar plantations.
Absolutely. Working in mines, on farms, in cities, artisan crafts, they were integral to the entire colonial economy.
So all this mixing, European, African, indigenous, it must have created incredibly complex societies.
Totally. Spain, Mexico is a prime example. You get these elaborate systems trying to classify people based on their mixed ancestry, castas.
But people could navigate these systems.
They did. People actively tried to manipulate these categories, get classified in ways that offered more advantages or fewer restrictions. It was fluid and contested. Even cities designed for separation, like Lima, with its separate Spanish and Indian quarters, saw constant mixing, borrowing, creation of new cultural forms.
And Mexico City becomes this key node connecting not just the Americas and Europe, but also Asia through the silver trade.
Exactly. Goods, ideas, people flowing through. It was a crucial link shaping how Europe even understood places like China.
Amidst all this control and exploitation, though, there was resistance. You mentioned maroon communities.
Yes, really important. Escaped slaves, sometimes joined by indigenous people, formed their own independent communities. Quilombos in Brazil, like Palmares,
Correct.
maroon settlements elsewhere.
Mars was huge, wasn't it? Like a kingdom.
It was. Lasted for decades. A major challenge to Portuguese authority. And figures like Gaspar Yanga in Mexico led big revolts, formed communities that raided Spanish caravans, real centers of resistance.
Did they form alliances?
Often, yes. Alliances with other indigenous groups, sometimes even temporary alliances with rival Europeans, like the English privateers against the Spanish, whatever worked.
And in Florida, you said Maroons teamed up with the Seminole.
Yeah, a powerful alliance. Their knowledge of the swamps, combined with the impact of diseases on invading U.S. troops, made them incredibly difficult to defeat for a long time. Their legacy continues today. Maroon communities in Suriname, Jamaica, elsewhere are still fighting for rights and land.
It's a vital counter-narrative to the story of complete domination. Shows agency and resilience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the book's concluding idea, this concept of the Homogenocene.
The homogenocene. Explain that one more time.
It's man's term for our current era, the age of biological homogenization, thanks to the Columbian exchange kicking things off. And now, modern transport, species are being shuffled around the globe constantly. Things are becoming more similar everywhere.
Blurring the lines of what's native.
Exactly. He uses the example of a Filipino folk song, Bahay Kubo, listing all the plants around a traditional hut. Turns out, most of those plants listed tomato, squash, peanut are originally from the Americas.
Wow. So even deeply ingrained cultural things are products of this exchange.
Right. It shows how profound the mixing has been. But this homogenization isn't always benign. Invasive species like the golden apple snail devastating rice paddies in Asia, another American import, show the downside.
So preserving local biodiversity gets harder and harder in a world that's so interconnected.
It's a massive challenge. Economic pressures, people wanting familiar things. It all pushes towards more homogenization.
Well, this deep dive into 1393 and the Columbian Exchange,
Yeah.
it really drives home that history isn't just dates and kings. It's this incredible complex dance between biology, economics, and people.
Yeah, a single plant moving across an ocean could trigger chain reactions that reshape societies and ecosystems halfway around the world, still shaping them, really.
So what stands out most to you from all this? What's the biggest surprise or takeaway?
For me, maybe it's just the sheer scale and the interconnectedness, how Potosi silver affected Ming China, how African resistance to malaria shaped labor patterns in Virginia, how potatoes changed European history. It's all linked in ways I hadn't fully grasped before, and how those consequences, good and bad, are still playing out.
Yeah, I agree. The interconnectedness and the often completely unintended consequences, it definitely makes you look at the world, even just your dinner plate, differently. It challenges those simpler historical narratives.
Makes you think about the hidden histories behind everyday things.
Absolutely. So we'd love to hear from you all listening. What moment or fact from this discussion really struck you? What surprised you? Or maybe how does this perspective change how you think about history?
Let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your aha moments, any questions you still have. Let's keep the conversation going.
Definitely. Exploring these long ripples from 1493 is so important. Thanks so much for taking this deep dive with us today.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you next time.